Martin, you have served, of course, as a county commissioner in Lincoln County, but you have decided this time to run for the North Carolina Senate. Why?
Two reasons. First reason was a number of elected officials felt that their Senate representation was not doing them any good. And second is, as a county commissioner, I found a lot of things, at least 16 or 17 things that we were told by the county attorney typically, oh, you can't do that because the state won't let you. It's against this rule or that law or something like that. And if we're going to change those, somebody has to go to Raleigh and start changing them. And I think I can get a start on that by doing that. A lot of the things that the county would like to accomplish are really constrained or handcuffed by the state's laws.
What would you consider to be the major issues that will be facing the General Assembly?
School safety is probably the number one. I don't know what the answer is, but there's certainly a lot of emphasis on that. The General Assembly has decided to reduce class sizes in kindergarten through grade 3, and there'll be the issue of finding the money for that. That's probably $250,000 for that, if they do it by hiring more teachers. And I'm not convinced that's the right thing to do, because after all, it doesn't take a teacher with a master's degree in education to teach Johnny how to spell cat. You're talking kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. It doesn't take a major degree to do that. We need probably more teacher assistants to solve that issue, I think, under the supervision of a serious teacher. I think that's a cheaper solution and would get better traction and allow us to get class size reduced, going up to 4, 5, and 6 perhaps.
Education, of course, takes up nearly half of the state budget. So obviously it's a big part of the expense for the state. There's been talk about teacher pay. Teacher pay has been raised. What is your opinion on teacher pay in North Carolina?
I've got two comments. First of all, somebody told us we were 43rd or something like that. Well, there are two problems with that analysis. One is that you're including a whole bunch of high-paid teachers in high-priced states. A teacher in Palo Alto makes $115,000 a year at 10 years in, but a teacher in Palo Alto can't find a house within 50 miles that's less than $1.5 million. You know, 3-bedroom ranch is what that costs. So there are issues with comparing cost of living versus salaries. Also, we have typically a younger teaching force than other states because they're losing students, so they haven't been hiring young teachers for a while. All of those tend to basically distort the comparison that you want. Despite all that, teachers need to get paid more. I spent 3 years in Scandinavia where teachers were considered to be up with engineers and just below doctors in terms of status. And I didn't know what they got paid, but I thought they got paid pretty well for that characteristic. And not surprisingly, Finland and Sweden and Norway and those kinds of places have very, very high education rates. They are leading in the top 10 of the world in school scores, so we're not doing as well as we could. And teacher pay is one aspect of that. It's not the only one, because throwing money at the problem is not necessarily the only solution. You have to be a little smarter about how you use your money.
You have said that you believe that teacher pay in North Carolina should be competitive with the other states surrounding us. Georgia, I think, is #1 in the southeast, but then, of course, it costs a good bit more to live in Atlanta than it does in Lincolnton. South Carolina, though, is still slightly ahead of us.
Yeah, we need to be #1 or at least tied for #1, despite the cost of living in Georgia. We should be up at the top in the southeast.
One of the issues that has come up recently, one of the other candidates for the North Carolina Senate has screamed foul because of a political action committee that he says took out ads not favoring you, but actually favoring his other opponent, and definitely saying some things negatively about him. He says it's over some potential legislation, although it has never yet been introduced, that he had talked about introducing to allow physicians' assistants and nurse practitioners to do some additional medical procedures. He, of course, also did introduce legislation in the last session of the General Assembly related to allowing optometrists to perform certain procedures that currently are restricted to medical doctors, ophthalmologists. At the same time, while he has talked about that money coming out of Raleigh, it's also true that if we look at the campaign financing report that came out, that was due this past Monday from all of the candidates, that a great deal of his support is in fact coming from optometrists and from some folks not within our district. Would you comment?
The numbers, I put it in an ad today actually. My funding is 97% within the district. So I got very little money outside. A couple of donors happen to live in Charlotte. I got no PAC money. I got nothing from any organized group that I'm aware of, unless they're disguising their donors, but I'm sure they're not. Senator Curtis is crying foul when he's doing the same thing. When he gets 49 or 50% of his money from the optometrists, then he's basically got to do what they say. If he gets 28% of his money from the Senate leadership, he's got to do what they say. I think that's the problem with money in politics. When you take PAC money, if you can take a little bit from somebody, you can tell them, well, you're only paying for access. You get to come in and talk to me. But if they're paying half your bills, then you're basically owned by them, in my opinion. And that's the problem with that kind of thing. He has not had clean hands. He's attacked Ted Alexander in a couple of ads that he basically funded or had controlled anyway. And as to who's funding his opposition, it's the ophthalmologists. Hard to say that, because they finally came out with an ad that talked about this eye surgery thing on Thursday. I think it hit the mails. And that's who's really funding it. Also, the funding reports, who Clear Action is not obvious, but the people who put the money into them is $200,000 from the ophthalmologists and $50,000 from the anesthesiologists. So we've got two medical groups who are ganging up on them, on Dr. Curtis. So I'm trying to stay away from all that stuff and just concentrate on running my campaign.
But you do consider it important that the money for campaigns not come from political action committees or out-of-area donors?
It would be preferable if we could get that into the law. There's apparently some issues with the Supreme Court ruling that basically say that can't happen. I'm not quite sure that's true. In any case, when you get one particular point of view being your main donor, your only donor really, then they own you. And that's a bad place to be.
Education, of course, is the biggest expense for the state, but another big expense and certainly an issue is transportation. You live in eastern Lincoln County, so you're familiar with the transportation problems that we have, the need for money for roads, and the solution appears at times to be very difficult. Can you elaborate on what you think might be workable to fund the transportation needs of the state?
My basic philosophy is that people should be taxed who are getting the benefit of the taxes. And so what you need to do is follow the money. If you're having a large growth area and more roads are demanded because of the growth, then the people who caused the growth ought to be paying that bill. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you tax the new home buyers. You have to look at who's making money from the whole thing. You put in a new superhighway or a new light rail system, inevitably the value of the land immediately adjoining goes way up. And in no case that I'm aware of are the landowners who make that windfall paying anything towards the new infrastructure. On the other hand, you also have to look at the cities and counties who are getting a tax windfall from all the new development. They're not contributing a dime towards that infrastructure either. And despite the fact that they're getting a big windfall, and yes, they got to provide more services, but government's supposed to be more efficient. So having them contribute 10 or 15% of their windfall back to the infrastructure would be a way to solve that problem. The real problem we have is unless we find some large pockets of money like those, then we're never going to find the money to build the roads we need, because according to the numbers by the DOT, we need a large amount of money. I forget how many billions of dollars, but we've got like 60% of it available over the next 10 years. So we're going to continue to kick the can down the road unless we change the strategy very dramatically. And I think those two things that I mentioned will make a large dent in that. At the same time, you're going to have local municipalities decide to some extent whether they really want that road. Are they willing to suffer the tax consequences and have a tax surcharge in the area or something like that to pay for it? They may decide no, and they may decide, yeah, we'll jump on top of that. But it gets to be more of a local decision as opposed to a state decision, and that's what I'm more in favor of.
What other issues do you see coming up in the General Assembly, and your opinion on what should be done on those?
I'm not aware of any major things that we're going to be facing. Voter ID is a big issue, but I've been told there's a constitutional amendment going on the fall ballot for that. And apparently 70% of the voters will approve it. So that's taking care of the one big issue that I think remains. So there aren't any huge issues. We of course have the roads and transportation issues, but we also have water and sewer issues too. The sort of incremental tax on the neighboring properties would work well for water and sewer. In both cases, you want the state to have to fund the first 4 or 5 years of interest payments to get those places over the hump to where there's actually new development to tax. Because putting on a new tax on a development area that hasn't yet started to grow is a waste of time. You've got no increased value. And it's the increased value that you want to tax, not the basic value. So if your property doubles, you want to be taxing the amount that it doubled by, not the original value there. But I'm not aware of any really big issues that are about to hit the General Assembly.
Probably the most important question I can ask you is why a voter should choose you on Tuesday as opposed to one of your two opponents.
I've got more experience in general. My four years on the county commission has taught me a lot about what the state does to us. Before that, I was a business analyst. I took apart financial reports and operational reports in order to do business models for large corporations. That allows me to be a business analyst, a number cruncher, to take things apart. Very few people in the General Assembly have that experience, and I think that's something that I can add to the mix down there. I've also, over the past 4 years, helped a lot with local people who have development issues. I've managed to get all the developers, except perhaps one, to come in and talk to local residents, even when they didn't have to, and explain what they're doing. And as often as not, the residents come away happy because they've at least been explained what's going on, and usually that has prompted the developer to pony up some additional thing. A typical example is the most recent Fairfield Forest development, which was platted in 1989, one day before zoning started, so it was sort of grandfathered. And so the local residents are kind of left out in the cold. What's going on here? How do we know anything? Well, the developer, at my request, held a meeting 10 days ago and told everybody what they were doing and what it would look like, and everybody seemed to come away happy. And that developer also decided that he would pay for a right-hand turn lane at Fairfield Forest and Business 16, which he didn't actually have to do. And so I think that's a win-win for everybody. Getting people to talk and getting everybody on the same meeting room and sharing ideas, I think, is what I've contributed to the process over the last couple of years. Our current state senator has basically ignored his constituents, and I've done exactly the opposite. I've been very, very out front and meeting with all the developments, and all my constituents get their phone calls returned.